They show no reverence for their parents or their elders. They have no restraint. They talk like they know everything. But what we call wisdom, they call foolishness. Even the girls are forward, immodest, and unladylike in their speech, behavior, and dress. Thaxter Dick, no. I'm sorry. Peter the Hermit from 1274. So a contemporary, but nonetheless. And then the great Aristotle from the 4th century BC. Young people think too highly of themselves. Their optimism deceives them to thinking they can do anything they want. They would rather do things to get attention rather than things that are useful. They act by feeling rather than by reason. All their mistakes have this in common: they do everything excessively. They overdo everything. They love too much, hate too much, and the same with everything else. One might question whether Aristotle overdid that quotation, but nevertheless. So you have a quote that comes from 800 years ago, 2,300 years ago, 2,700 years ago. What it illustrates is something the Bible told us a long time ago, and that is there's nothing new under the sun. What goes around comes around. I'm reminded of what James Baldwin said. Children have never been very good at listening to their elders, but they have never failed to imitate them. And that is so true. And that's just more verification of what we were talking about yesterday, that old people and young people are not really that different, at least in the fundamental ways that matter. Young people are really no more likely than old people to lose their faith. Perhaps one thing that skews our perception are the number of young people who seem to fall away, but perhaps never even made their faith their own to begin with. In which case, how can you really fall away from something you never really had? But even if you include that number, it does not justify the conclusion that somehow young people are more prone to apostasy. You know, for every young person in their youthful vigor just speeding down the highway toward destruction, there's some old guy on the same road. And granted, he's wearing a hat, he's driving 25 miles under the speed limit, and he leaves his blinker on the whole time, but he's going to wind up in the same place. We are all destined for that same destruction. People say death is the great equalizer, but really sin is the great equalizer, and death is just one of the manifestations of that. G.K. Chesterton was getting at this when he said, "The old man is always wrong, and the young people are always wrong about what is wrong with him." The practical form it takes is this: that while the old man may stand by some stupid custom, the young man always attacks it with some theory that turns out to be equally stupid. Again, the Bible affirms we have all sinned, young and old alike. We all have the same fundamental problem. The nature of man is the same. The nature of sin is the same. And God's solution is the same. We cannot begin talking in a way that makes it sound like there's a gospel for old people and there's a gospel for young people. Now, I like teen studies just as much as the next person, but we do have to be careful not to leave the impression that somehow the blood of Christ flows differently for old people than it does for young people. Now, I get it that there are generational differences, technological change, things like that. You always have to demonstrate the relevance of the gospel to each individual and circumstance that they find themselves in. But again, when it comes to the big things, these generational differences don't begin to compare with the fact that we are all in sin, and God's solution to the problem of sin does not change. We all find ourselves in the same situation, on the verge of destruction because of our sin. So we have to turn our attention in a different direction to consider what's wrong with young people today. And there's another very common answer that people give, and it is sex. Teenagers are just bundles of raging hormones. Sex is all they can think about. When we read in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 22 that Paul warns Timothy to flee youthful lust, we almost assume without question that he's talking about sexual temptation. Now, I want to be careful here because I know for a number of you, The sexual urge seems very strong, so overwhelming that it seems almost powerless to do anything about it. The last thing you want to hear me say is it gets worse as you get older. And I'm not here to say that. I'm not here to say it's going to get any worse. But it will not get any better unless you apply some effort to it. And instead of saying, well, I just will throw up my hands and quit because I'm just doomed. No, if you will apply yourself with an intentional effort, you can overcome and not be enslaved to your body. But it takes hard work, like anything else that has any value. So again, my point is that if your hope for sexual control rests in your aging body easing up on its sexual demands on you, that it's going to somehow become a more relenting taskmaster over time, I think this is a false hope. In over 30 years of preaching and trying to help people with their personal problems, I can tell you the most common sins I've had to deal with are sexual in nature, and I have seen far more sexual dysfunction and perversity among older Christians than among young Christians. In fact, the greatest demographic for pornography are middle-aged men. And by the way, if Paul was talking about sexual sins when he was talking to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 22, we need to remember that he was a young man who was at least in his 30s when Paul wrote 2 Timothy to him. So much for sex being what's wrong with young people these days. Well, let's consider Galatians chapter 5, verses 19 through 21. Now, the works of the flesh are evident, which are sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmities, strife, jealousy, outbursts of anger, disputes, dissensions, factions, envying, drunkenness, carousing, and things like these. Now, even if we were to assume for a moment that young people are somehow more susceptible to the things at the beginning and end of this list, things like sex and drugs or alcohol, we would do well to remember that this text really is what Phil Roberts would call the devil's sandwich. You have the fluffy stuff on the outside, but the real meat of it is on the inside. Envy, divisiveness, and pride. Plenty of young people have wrecked their lives. Plenty of old people have wrecked their lives. How many congregations do you know that have been torn apart by the young people? Oh, I'm sure there's a few. But dozens and hundreds have been destroyed by their elders. Even here at Florida College, I can say that I have been directly and personally sinned against far more often by my fellow employees than by the students. Now, what is wrong with young people? There is something fundamentally wrong with you. And I'm going to tell you what that is tomorrow. But it's not these things we've been talking about so far. So keep your chin up. And it's not so bad. Come back tomorrow and we'll see the conclusion of the story.
I was talking to one of you yesterday, and you said that you were writing in your book of things that you're grateful for about Dr. Hamilton's talk yesterday. And isn't it wonderful to have someone like this who can share such wisdom with us? I'm so grateful for this, and I pray God's blessings on his ministry, his work with us. It's so good to be able to learn from people who are so much older than us, isn't it? So some announcements here this morning. Please stop by the Riverview Center to have your yearbook picture taken. Photographers will be there until 5 p.m. today at the Riverview. That's the yearbook pictures. I understand that Dr. Johnson and Mr. McCrae are in the house. Is that correct? Oh, Dr. Johnson is. All right, there you go.
Okay. If there's one thing that we can all agree on, it is that Disney practically owns the world. Yeah. With theme parks around the world, merchandising in every major retail store, and a streaming service to rival Netflix and Hulu, Disney has effectively taken over all avenues of entertainment. And this is the most evident in the world of cinema. 7 of the 10 highest grossing films of all time belong to Disney now. They own Avatar. They own Marvel. They even own Star Wars. No. Now, but before Disney wrapped their four-fingered white-gloved paws around this beloved franchise, there was an independent company known as Lucasfilm. That's right. And they were solely responsible for bringing us the most widely beloved film trilogy of all time. And there is nothing Disney can do to take that away from us. What is wrong with you?
Aren't we watching Star Wars, Disney's greatest achievement
No!
on Friday night?
No, we are watching Empire Strikes Back, the second installment of Lucas's original Star Wars trilogy that had nothing to do with Disney.
Okay, so you're telling me that there was Star Wars before Disney? You mean that those movies weren't based on the original Hollywood Studios Millennium Falcon ride? Are you telling me that Princess Leia wasn't one of the first Disney princesses? And how do you explain Baby Yoda? You can't have grown-up Yoda without Baby Yoda. You can't just make prequels after you make the originals.
You uncultured, half-witted, scruffy-looking nerf herder! This is exactly why we need to have classic movie nights here on campus. That's right. All right. Every month, we are planning to host a movie right in Puckett Auditorium where we will watch some of the greatest films of the past 100 years. These will include such epics as Lawrence of Arabia, musical delights like Guys and Dolls, and the action-adventure classic Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Lawrence of Arabia. Is that a spin-off of Aladdin? I've heard of Guys and Dolls. That was the original working title of Toy Story, right? And, Indiana Jones. He's in Raiders of the Lost Ark. He has a sick ride at Disneyland.
Please come and join us Friday night at 7 p.m. in Puckett Auditorium, where we will watch the original, what is now known as the despecialized version of Star Wars Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, the way that it was originally intended to be.
Let's stand for the pledge.